this is so critically important that we recognize we have to preserve, if not even enhance, the funding. So the other language of this amendment captures that, and I think it's read by saying that the critical role, we recognize the critical role that human services organizations fill, and it's our intent to fund annual adjustments in times of both economic prosperity and economic hardship.
Well, you're hearing the voice of Bruce Harrell there before he was mayor as city council president in 2019. He sponsored an amendment to an ordinance requiring the city to increase human service provider pay along with the rate of inflation. Now, as mayor, his new budget proposal is suggesting something else entirely. We're going to dive into that today. We're going to talk about some new spending on therapeutic courts, what happens next with those pesky parking enforcement officers, and David is looking at a major problem with sidewalks statewide that you're going to want to stick around and listen to. All that and more here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own, and I'm joined by David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. David, reporter involvement story here. I saw on your Twitter feed that you'd finally been able to get a COVID booster a short while ago. What was that process like? This has not been easy for a lot of people.
No, it seems like at this point it should just be a matter of you
Click
can
done.
walk up to a counter and they'll stick a needle in your arm. It's clearly
right.
Really not that. I mean, it still sort of felt like it did at the beginning of the pandemic when you kind of had to chase around for a shot. I did finally get one. In fact, I'm feeling the effects a little bit today.
Oh boy.
But not nearly as bad as past shots, which is encouraging though. So.
Okay, stick with me for another 28 minutes, man. We'll get
you.
Yeah,
No. This is way better than even the last booster I got. I feel
good.
That, so.
Good. All right, good to know. I know I've been through a few boosters myself, and it hasn't been too bad, but I know that hasn't been the experience for everybody. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to our listeners. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. They, of course, on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our patrons. We just had Alex join our ranks at the $10 level, meaning Alex will get one of the last Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mugs in existence. Get them. They're going fast here, folks. You're joining a proud group here, Alex. It's chock full of cool people like Jim, whose photo we are featuring on our mugshot of the week. An all-time favorite here with Jim's dog, Mabel. You think you've had a tough day? Tell it to a basset hound. Hang in there, Mabel. Thank you for the support, Mabel and Jim. Everybody else, please become a patron. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Finally, a big thanks to Converge Media. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday evenings at 7. All right, let's get her going with right here, right now. Well, the city budget process shifts into gear this week as the city council has its last regular meeting before it's all budget all the time. Put October 11th on your calendar, folks. The first public hearing on the budget is on that date at 5 p.m. And David, here we are with a bit of a reversal, I guess you have to call it. Mayor Harrell is talking about amending the law he supported as a council member in 2019, such that mandatory pay raises for human services workers would be capped at 4% a year, or half the current rate of inflation. Now, this is a very interesting thing in terms of what the mayor is doing now as opposed to what he did as a council member. Did anybody expect a pandemic? Of course not. Or expect inflation to be at a 40-year high? Of course not. But the message here, David, is a really tough one, I think, for the mayor to reconcile. What do you take away from his proposal to cap the pay for human services workers, the people who are doing this very difficult work of serving the homeless people?
I take away that he's mayor now when he was but when he was on the city council, which is I think in every mayor's budget to a certain extent there's they leave some gaps, some uncomfortable gaps, and then make it the city council's responsibility to fill them. And this is one of them. And so I mean, I think it's easier to vote as one of 9 than it is to be the person setting the budget from the start. I think it is striking. The timing of it is a bit striking just because it's well acknowledged, and it has been for a long time, that service providers and social workers and things like that have incredible turnover rates and are not paid very well for really difficult work. That's now, of course, exacerbated by there being staffing shortages in every industry, really. And so at a time when, keeping up staffing to deliver important services is there's a lot of focus on that. I think for the city council, it's a tough pill to swallow, but it's also now an uncomfortable pill to swallow because it's kind of, if they want to change that, they have to find the money somewhere else.
That's right. That's right. And I'm thinking about here what's going on with the KCRHA, the King County Homelessness Authority. So these workers that we're talking about here are part of this contract that the city funds. And this is all under the administration of the KCRHA, but the Homeless Authority was asking for $90 million in additional city and county funding this year. The mayor's proposal offers $10 million, and most of that is set aside for shelters and tiny house villages. So really that part about pay raises, et cetera, is taken out of the mix here. And I know that salaries are always such a big part of the picture here. But if I could, David, let me try to take it to a larger story here. The mayor is also proposing to use jumpstart funds, the payroll tax on big businesses, to bolster the sagging general fund. So looking at this, folks, last year the council set some guidelines. If the general fund falls under $1.5 billion, the city can use jumpstart for other purposes. Now, the mayor is actually proposing to change that here again and connect that general fund benchmark to inflation, basically saying whenever inflation is high, the city's going to use jumpstart money for something other than what it was originally intended for: affordable housing, Green New Deal incentives. I think this storyline with David with jumpstart is very important. This is not where the council wanted this conversation and especially this funding to go.
No, and I think Councilmember Morales made an interesting point around this, which is when you remember the original head tax proposal that was such
Right.
a kerfuffle. The big kind of talking point that opponents used was, you don't have a plan for this. You're not telling people how it should be spent, and to a certain extent, some of members of the council who supported it actually kind of agreed with that,
Yeah.
which is why on the second round of this jumpstart tax, which is basically a revival of that head tax but bigger, they took a lot of pains to outline pretty specifically how this money was going to be used. And
Right.
there were a lot of reasons why that tax sailed through a lot more smoothly than the head tax, but I do think that was probably one of them, which is they preempted some of those criticisms by
Right.
being like, here's what we want to spend this money on. And so
Mhm.
to Councilmember Morales's point, to a certain extent, that clarity is what allowed that tax to exist in the first place. And so now to kind of suggest using it on other things other than what was promised at the time, there's some tension there. There's some friction there for sure.
Yeah.
That said, at the time when the tax was passed, they didn't have this level of budget shortfall. And so
No.
you can kind of understand the other side of this too, which is the money is there. The cuts have to come from somewhere. Let's use this to kind of lessen some of the pain and make maybe bigger investments in the future or something like that.
Right, right. And I know we've talked about inflation before and how it affects so many different parts of our economy, but clearly it's affecting what our city council is doing too. But I think this larger systemic issue is, and I know we touched on this last week, David, this is a big part of the issue because you've seen the graphs, I've seen the graphs here. We're not just talking about this year and next year, the biennium, as the city calls it, and planning their budgets, but take a look at 2024, 2025, 2026. This is an issue. There's a systemic problem with the budget, and this hole isn't really going away. And I think that's the part that worries me and worries the council too. Is Jumpstart continuing? Is it going to be continually used as basically a fix-all for the general fund for the city of Seattle?
Yeah, I do think that's the concern, and again, that's not what it was designed to do. But as we've talked about quite a few times, most mayors, if there is money that they see available or money that isn't maybe like fully ingrained, because the jumpstart is fairly new. I think not all of its effects have started to be felt yet, and so therefore, in some ways, that makes it a little easier to redirect the money because a lot of the projects haven't even really gotten off the ground that are funded by Jumpstart. So,
right.
It's interesting. I think if this did just become the kind of permanent budget gap filler, that's a much different promise than what was made a couple of years ago in this past.
Agreed. And it's just one of these interesting things where when these different taxes are brought forth to people, I think you'll see a lot of folks saying, wait a minute, we want to know exactly where this money is going. But then when they set those when those guidelines are set, then take a look a few years later. Well, these guidelines are too restrictive. We need to spend this money elsewhere. It's a very difficult conundrum to work through, I know, for the council. We'll see how they start hashing that out as these budget meetings really get underway over the next week. And I'm going to jump back to the budget writ large in just a minute here, but I wanted to take a quick look at something the council is putting in motion this week, setting up the municipal court with about $370,000 in grant funding. They're doing this at the council meeting on Tuesday to expand the community court system our city has. So just some background here, folks. The community court helps people get low-level misdemeanors dismissed through community service, connects people to housing, employment, drug treatment. And David, I wanted to highlight this because as much as we might be talking about, let's get tough on crime with the race for King County prosecutor, for example, or let's get more cops on the street in the city of Seattle, both very valid points there. I wanted to point out that quietly there is a community court piece to law enforcement in Seattle, and the city of Seattle is trying to fund it. I just wanted to ask you, do you feel like this restorative justice narrative is getting lost in the current election cycle?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I think, I mean, we've heard, obviously there was the election of Ann Davison as city attorney.
Right.
Which interestingly, under her watch, there's actually more kind of referrals to community court than there was before, which is really more of a reflection of the fact that she is declining fewer cases than her predecessors. So it's not that her office is suddenly much more interested in this. It's just that there are more total cases coming through. But, we kind of, from her campaign, heard a lot of skepticism about some of these diversion approaches. She has asked for sort of special authority to hold kind of the 100 top most quote prolific offenders in the city. So yes, I think that the restorative justice part of Seattle has quieted a bit, perhaps. That said, it's certainly not. I think if you were to poll the city council and the mayor, there's still support for these kind of approaches.
True. One last piece on this. The challenge with this funding in particular is it's a one-time grant from the state that would pay for a few employees to facilitate this program. And I've always wondered about this, David. Elected officials want to use the money that these grants provide, this one-time funding. If they don't, somebody else will. But when they add to these programs, it makes for some fiscal cliffs potentially in the future. Is it, let's prove how great this program is, and then maybe the city or some other source will keep funding it? Or what do you make of this whole one-time funding conundrum? It seems to be part of every budget every year.
And it's an approach that you can kind of get away with when you're planning on budgets staying the same or growing as they had for quite some time there. The real estate excise tax alone just kept going up and up. Of course, this year now we're seeing kind of the end of a lot of that. That party's over to a certain extent. So we've heard Mayor Harrell complain about how, a lot of he's inherited a lot of kind of one-off or, 2-year programs without long-term funding plans. And so, I think that's always sort of hard to imagine what comes next when you sort of fund these programs short-term. I think that's probably gotten a lot harder even in the last year, as we were just talking about with budget gaps. That said, this isn't a lot of money. It's only 100 and what was it, just under $200,000, which in the grand scheme is not very much, but that's a couple positions in a different department. So we'll see if it's interesting enough that the city would want to keep funding it.
Always. I'm always interested to track that and see how that goes. But thank you for the breakdown there, David. All right, up next, taking a closer look at the budget and what we now know about where parking enforcement officers are going to be going, what that means for the future of SPD and 911 alternatives. We're going to tackle this coming up on Now Hear This. So there we were, anxiously awaiting the mayor's budget presentation last week, fully expecting added investments in police and public safety, which we definitely saw. But then came the curious matter of parking enforcement officers, whom the mayor wants to move back into the Seattle Police Department from the SDOT, where they've been for less than a year. So the issue here is that might not be the permanent home either in the SPD for these officers. Here's what the mayor said last week about this.
While we continue our work to reimagine public safety, this may not be our PEO's final home. However, this move will avert nearly $5 million in general fund costs that can be applied towards important community investments.
David, I wanted to ask you about this because you covered the debacle uncovered at the start of the year, the PEOs, parking enforcement officers. The city moved them into SDOT, the Department of Transportation, but these officers didn't have the proper ticket writing authority. The city had to refund hundreds of thousands of tickets here. What does moving them back into SPD do? The mayor said it would actually save the city $5 million. I'm wondering a little bit about how that works and just your overall take on this move by the mayor.
Yeah, it's in some ways not that surprising. He didn't talk too publicly about this, but there was one moment when he was on, I think, a radio show on Cairo and was asked about this early in his tenure, and he called it an awkward move to move parking enforcement out of SPD into SDOT. That then, of course, got even more awkward when all these kind of issues around authority, who has authority to actually write tickets, and all these refunds of tickets. And so it seemed to just kind of confirm his skepticism of that move in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, well, and also, to add to that, the parking enforcement officers themselves did not support moving to the Seattle Department of Transportation. At one point they were okay with moving out of SPD, but they would have preferred to kind of stay in some public safety department, maybe the CSCC.
Communications Center, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But they never really supported moving into SDOT. But moving them back, I was talking to the president of the Parking Enforcement Guild. It's not actually going to be very hard, because despite all of this work that's been done around moving them to SDOT, nothing's really changed. So
they
SDOT,
never left. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
SDOT writes their paychecks is pretty much the only thing that's changed, but their offices are still in an SPD building. Their uniforms still say SPD. All their cars still say SPD.
Right.
And so, from the perspective of the parking enforcement officers, nothing has really changed, except for they don't feel like they have as good a communication with the police department. And so, we'll see kind of where I don't know that the city council is going to want to totally give up on this.
No,
just yet, but there's not a lot to show for the last, since September. So however many months that's almost basically there's not a lot to show for the last year.
Yeah.
To prove that this move
was the right way. Yeah.
Was the right way, and is in fact sort of pushing the city closer towards some goal of, a less of a law enforcement presence, that this is actually, effective in doing that. I don't know that there's any sort of proof of that. So I genuinely don't know what the city council is going to do, if they'll support the mayor on this, but if it does go through, then that, hard to see that as anything but kind of a flop, if just there was a year of bureaucratic headaches, only to turn back the clock and send them right back to SPD.
This larger goal of kind of dismantling this big behemoth of an organization that is the SPD, I think, is at the root of this, and trying to pull off some of these different roles, like the 911 call takers who are in the communication center, a separate department right now. And I think it's important to point out that Lisa Herbold, the chair of the Public Safety Committee, she was all about moving these enforcement officers, these parking enforcement officers, into the communication center. She really wanted to do that. The rest of her compatriots on the council were like, no, let's move them into SDOT. I think there was some friction there. And I talked to her office a little bit about this, David. And she had told me she was glad to see in the mayor making his statement here that he left the door open on moving these PEOs around and possibly to the CSCC in the future. But I just did want to try to look ahead to the future, if we could, David. How messy would that be to try to move these officers yet again? In the short term and the long term, I guess the goal is to get them out of that department and try to change the SPD moving forward. But I don't know, how messy of a move is that politically and logistically?
Yeah, I just don't know. I just don't know that there's the political capital or will to go through that again, because it took, it really took 2 years kind of planning, because this process started at the end of 2020, and really the parking enforcement didn't move to SDOT until the kind of towards the end of 2022. So that was a long process, and it still didn't go very well, clearly.
Right.
And so, and I get the sense that there's some headaches in the CSCC as well. It's not like all is perfect over there. And so, again, I mean, I think I think at the time when there was calls to defund the police, this was sort of a quick way to do that without actually upending the cart all that much, because it's a big number. It's, something like 20% of SPD was, quote, defunded, which was always a little misleading, because those functions never
Just
went
moved
away.
it.
But it was a reaction to a demand at the time, which was reduce the size of the Seattle Police Department. I don't know that those calls are as strong, and I also don't know that I think there's a lot more skepticism that this move accomplishes any goals of actually, making the police department a more, effective and just place. And also, I'm not sure it accomplishes the goals of parking enforcement and what those officers could be either. So, it would be a big headache. Someone would have to spend a lot of time and energy to move them again out of SPD. And there's a lot of other things that people are spending time and energy on right now. So we'll see. Maybe it's still a priority. I don't know, though. I guess I'm a little skeptical.
No, I am too. And I don't think the mayor had to spend all that much political capital to say, sure, we'll leave the door open for this thing to happen here. Because as you say, this would be a huge job for it to actually come through from the council's perspective. So we'll see what they end up saying in the budget here. So I wanted to move on to one quick piece here. Had to cover this bit of a bombshell from last week. The plaintiffs in the case against former Mayor Durkin and the city of Seattle are now saying the mayor physically deleted, or someone physically deleted, nearly 200 texts from the mayor's phone, the former mayor's phone, during the CHOP, the protest of 2020. Former Mayor Durkin says this isn't true, says this is a last-ditch kind of Hail Mary from these merchants who are suing the city. David, just quickly on this, what was your reaction to this story?
My reaction is, if it's true, I mean, there was some, the kind of argument before from the mayor was somebody, and it was unclear who, had changed her phone to the auto delete function. And
I think she was trying to blame the Department of Information Technology.
Which they then sort of deflected that blame to a certain extent. But, if that was true, she had some sort of deniability that she even knew this was happening. But if there are, in fact, texts that are being manually deleted, that's a little different of a story, because then you've got sort of two fronts. You've got the auto delete function, and you've also got people going back in and deleting these. It sounds like there's some nuance, there's some back and forth here. The city attorney's office sort of counter accused the plaintiffs in this case of their own, deleting their own evidence. So it's a little messy.
I'm not deleting text, you're deleting text.
Exactly. So it's a little messy, and I don't know how it's going to shake out. But at first blush, if there were in fact texts being manually deleted, that shows a little more level of agency in this process, and therefore, frankly, more culpability.
I wonder, do you think this has any impact on this idea from the King County prosecutor, Dan Satterberg? He asked the sheriff's department to open an investigation into this matter. As it was reported in the Times, it doesn't look like that investigation has anything to update here. But does this add some pressure to that idea to actually investigate this at a county sheriff level?
I think it probably does, because again, that means there are more hands involved in this and a little more intentionality. It's not like just some mistake that happened along the way. If this is true, again, I think
it's a big
probably more to this than we know. But it certainly doesn't. I guess I'll say that it certainly doesn't dissuade this investigation from moving forward, and it seems to kind of give it more reason to exist and continue.
Fair to say. All right, well, up next, some sobering news about just how bad the situation is when it comes to sidewalks, not just in Seattle, but statewide. David's got the breakdown on Transportation Talk. David, I was a little bit shocked to read that recent piece of yours in the Seattle Times about sidewalks around our state. You looked at about 30 cities and counties around Washington state, couldn't even find one that had 50% compliance with Americans with Disabilities Act requirements for people who are disabled. What did you find out with this story? Is this a solvable problem? This just seemed overwhelming in reading this.
Yeah, it is overwhelming. And that was a warning I kept getting from my editor was, can we include any kind of hope in this story? Mostly, unfortunately, the answer is no, because So I got interested in this because if you remember, in 2015, the city of Seattle was sued by Disability Rights Washington over the state of specifically its curb ramps. So to get up and down sidewalks, and came to a settlement agreement in which they are obligated to fix 300, basically 1,200 curb ramps a year and spend $300 million over 16 years. But I was curious, I wasn't convinced that this is just a Seattle problem. And fortunately for me, as part of the ADA, any city with more than 50 employees has to write up an evaluation of its public facilities, including sidewalks and roads. And so, they have done a lot of this work already, calculating just how bad it is. And so all it takes is just kind of clicking through them and reading them. And when you do that, yeah, it's clear that as far as what the ADA requires, cities are nowhere close. And you threw out that 50% number, but it's closer to 3/4 non-compliance across all cities.
Wow.
So it's, and as part of those plans, they have to come up with an estimate of how much it costs. And the numbers are, head spinning. It's, unincorporated King County alone would have to spend $500 million bringing all of these up to ADA compliance. So we're looking at billions across the state. It's a big problem. I don't know that it's so big that I don't know that anyone, there aren't really any heads rolling, because it's, there's like not even a,
what can we do?
Yeah. And the kind of larger problem here is that it really only falls on local cities and counties to solve this problem. There's, despite it being a federal requirement, there's really no federal money.
There you go.
And there's no state. There's some state money, but it's part of a larger pool intended for sidewalks and pedestrian facilities. There's no pool of money specifically for ADA compliance. And so these cities are literally looking at projects that would be their entire budget for several years to fix. So it's which is not really an option. But if you're a person in a wheelchair, the result of this is your civil rights, which is what the ADA
is all about. Yeah,
it's a new civil right for people with disabilities are being violated every day, because a place that somebody who is not disabled can walk, someone in a wheelchair can't, and that's illegal. But it's, the problem is so bad that it's something that most organizations and governments would rather look the other way about.
Yeah. Is it a situation where you're sensing pressure from other attorneys to file more lawsuits to try to change the dynamic on this, or what do you think?
Yeah, there could be. I mean, I think, I don't know that they would all be guaranteed success, because there's some question about whether, simply showing that you are aware of the problem might be enough to kind of get you out of litigation. But for people who live in these cities and towns, that's really the only option they have, which is not an easy option. But there's no other enforcement mechanism beyond suing a city or county to make this happen. And so we'll see. It obviously it takes some resources and some organization and some legal skill to, of
course,
bring these cases, which a lot of these small towns that might just not exist. But I'll be curious to see if more now that this issue is kind of out there a little bit, if more people kind of poke around at, well, what kind of litigation can we bring?
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to watch that, and also that interesting piece about the federal dollars that should be involved. This feels so much like the McCleary case that we were talking about as reporters over the past several years here for the state's requirements when it comes to education. And, it's written as a paramount duty. And I know when I think about ADA, it makes me think of these same things about these requirements that the state, the feds, whoever else can't necessarily back up with the dollars. So always good to break those down. And thank you for that piece, David. Very, very eye-opening stuff. All right, it's time to wrap up. And I, of course, have been keeping track of the Mariners roller coaster. David has too. For the first time in 21 years, they are going to the playoffs. Big cheer for that. Absolutely awesome. But just when it looked like the team was getting healthy, Sam Haggerty, bona fide badass here, plays the Godfather theme when he walks up to the plate. A great utility player, gets hurt in another crazy loss, this time to the lowly Tigers. Once again, David, take me back from the ledge here. I know the Mariners clinched. That was an awesome moment, but what now in the playoffs? I'm so worried for this team going forward.
I haven't looked lately, but not that long ago I looked, and their record against teams that are better than 500 is almost identical to their record against teams that are worse than 500. So if there's any, and I bet over the last couple of weeks it's probably actually better than less than 500. So if there's any consolation,
no kidding.
If there's any consolation, there's some evidence that they seem to do better against good teams. And if that's true, then they're going to have plenty of opportunity to do so.
No kidding. No kidding.
In Toronto.
Yeah, right. That's what it looks like here. Toronto has been on a tear, so we'll see what happens there. It was good to see Julio Rodriguez back, but Sam Haggerty, Heal up, my man. Hope you get better. And David and I are counting on you with the rest of Seattle. So thank you, David, as always. And thank you, everybody out there listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is available on all the major platforms, wherever you listen. And again, if you are a listener, please support the show on Patreon. We couldn't do it without you. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.